My name is Dave Kolstad. I live in the northern part of the city of Los Angeles, and I learned how to make pens by watching YouTubes. And the reason I've chosen to make this YouTube is I couldn't find answers to a number of things that I ran into trouble with. For example, I set aside using acrylics because they're so brittle they chip and go all over the place, and I was unable to figure out what do I do until I finally asked somebody who did know just turn it at a very high speed. I have found, so some of what I'll be sharing with you is preference. I don't like to make wood pens out of walnut or birch or maple because they have no interesting grain. I use Bocate. I just love it. B-O-C-A-T-E. It's a wood that comes out of Central America, and it is just absolutely gorgeous. So as I go through this, I'm going to be trying to point out problem areas and how I've resolved them. One big problem area, for example, is what happens if it does chip out and I don't have a big enough pen? It comes out too short. Can I shorten the pen? Oh, it took me a long time to discover. Yes, I can. I can change that. So let's get to it. Here's my shop. Obviously, it's a garage, which has its disadvantages in that I have to clean up after every session in order to put the cars away. And it's quite small. I can't buy some of the nice equipment that I do admit to drooling over sometimes that people are able to put in another one. I also have a lot of setup time that I have to work out, so it isn't as efficient as it might be. But the big advantage, of course, is I'm with my family. I don't have to go away. They're more important than anything I might make, and it does force me to be a lot more creative than I otherwise might. Here are some of the pens I've made. I really like making them out of exotic woods. This is a slimline, of course. I make them all slimline. This one is made out of Bocate, which I buy at a exotic wood store in West Los Angeles. This one, I give people 3 years to figure out what I made that from. I made it from a pine cone. But you know there are two halves, top and bottom, and I had 27 failures after I made these two. So I gave up making pine cones. And then sometime later I learned about stabilizing wood. So I got a different kind of pine cone and I stabilized it before I turned it. And this pine cone is quite different. But it's absolutely fascinating, just I think gorgeous. And then I use acrylic. This is my favorite acrylic because the colors in this purple just really, you can't see it too well in this video, but they can be just absolutely stunning. Couple other things I've made. Here are 2 ice cream scoops. This one made out of wood, obviously, and this one at a trade show I found a really neat insert or blank, acrylic blank to make this from. Took a while to figure out how to do it, how to turn it and turn it well. The workhorse of my shop is a shopsmith. Here I'm getting it set up with a bandsaw to use. But let's talk about turning speeds, because I really had trouble with those acrylics. I couldn't figure out how to do it until somebody said turn them at a fast speeds. He turns about 3,000 RPM. Here are the preset settings on my shopsmith. I use 900 RPM for most of my sanding, and I use 3,450 for most of my turning, especially the acrylics. And that makes a huge difference. It makes it successful. Here's a little storage device I rigged up. When I started turning, people would have me use bushings. And when I would sand them down to where they got to too small a diameter, I would move from large and acceptable to a smaller size. Keeping track of those things really drives me nuts. And you do have to be careful. So what happens is now I just eyeball it. I get it down close. And that's close enough. But then I take the time to use the band to make sure I have the right size. And you can see here I have a couple of different ones ready to go, because what happens so often you'll have a failure. The thing will fly apart. Here's a pine cone blank that flew apart on the lathe. That's not usable. Oh, really? Well, what I do is I save the tubes, and they're not always savable, of course. But you don't have to use a new one every time. And here, take a look at these two. This one is obviously much shorter than the other. It took me a long time to realize that the bottom part of a pen has to be precise because you have the length of the ink tube. But the top portion, underneath the clip, has a fair amount of blank space in it. So I don't have to get these all exactly right. If this one fails, I throw it away. but this one I can probably use. And then, so these two are waiting for the other half of that color when I get around. Not wanting to buy a special tool or store a special tool so that I could drill my blanks, I rigged up a little device here where I can just hold it while I drill it in the drill press when I have the shopsmith equipped for that. But I found far too many failures. You can see how, and you can imagine how, at the top it starts out just beautifully, right smack in the center, but does it come out at the center at the bottom? No, and too often that fails. Now the thickness of the wood that you have to work with around the brass tube, this measures 3/64. That's all you have between the tube and the bare sky. So it's quite thin, and particularly with the acrylics, sometimes you can see right through them. Here's one that failed on the lathe. You can see how it just came apart on me. I was just turning along merrily. Oh, I can figure out how to use that, but I'll show you in a few minutes how I've started drilling, and I've been able to abandon this little device. Proud to have made it myself, not proud that it doesn't work very well. A very simple tip. At an office supply store, I bought this set of bins. So when I receive my supply of pen turning kits, I have the tubes, the clips, the transmissions, and so on, just in this little compartmentalized device. Really simple, very helpful. A brass tube, a new one, measures 2 1/16 of an inch. This acrylic that I bought measures 6 1/8 in length. You can't divide that by 3 and have 3 pieces come out all right. And being a tightwad, I have to figure out how can I do this. I want to get, instead of 8 blanks, I want to get 12 blanks from it. And I think I figured out a way to do it. And I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes when we go to the bandsaw. So now what I've done is I've taken one of these solid blanks that measures about 1.5 inches square and cut it 4 ways on the bandsaw, using the bandsaw so the saw kerf doesn't damage as much material. And now I'm ready to run this, to drill it through the center. And you can see here how some of these are not the same size. I'm not real concerned about getting them absolutely square and even to go in some sort of a clamp. I'm going to hold it in a different way. What I did is I put a small pilot hole in the end there. Here you can see the fragility of the acrylic. It chipped out. This one I might not be able to get 3 portions of tubes from. I might be able to only use 2, and then the third one will be a waste. Don't know yet, but let me show you how I drill these. Okay, what I've done here is I've made sure that the point of my drill bit is aligned very carefully with the tailstock over here. You want those to be really straight. I've got my tiny little hole there just as a pilot to hold it in the right place. Again, I don't care if it's exactly in the center. I just eyeball that. I'm going to drill it fairly fast at about 2,000 RPM, but because I believe heat to be a real problem with acrylics, I'm going to be pulling it out of there quickly, or often, let's say, to clear the bit and make sure I'm okay. So 2,000 RPM. Oh, and I am wearing a mask. Let me show you the mask if you can see it, because when those acrylic chips come flying out of there, they can really be hurtful. So let's see what happens. Again, I just go down to the depth stop and then get another one and pop it on there. Okay, now we're ready to drill the other end. I've got a rotating tailstock here. I would like to use the brass tube to fill this hole because it would fill it completely, but instead I have a 1/4 inch drill bit in here, and it turns out the difference between that and the 7 millimeters is only 1/64 of an inch. So I'm hardly going to worry about that. I'm just trying to keep this thing from skirting around a whole lot. Slide this on here, and I'm ready to roll. So we'll drill it. Okay, let's show you how I can really be a tightwad. What I'm trying to do is get 3 brass sections out of each of these blocks that I've made. I cut those big blocks of acrylic into sections. 4 of them. I'm not concerned about them being very precise, as we talked about earlier. I did drill all the way through them with my 7mm drill bits, brad point drill bits, and I did have to stop and sharpen both of them because this acrylic is pretty hard as well as being brittle. Then I made a storyboard, which is just a little tool that's cut exactly to the length of the brass tube that I want to put in there. Then I made a mark on the block each way, and I have exactly the right amount of length for one of these brass tubes. 1, 2, 3. I've cut them out previously. 1, 2, 3. If the last one, the center one, of course, comes out perfectly, there's not going to be any need to remove waste material because there is no waste material. The one on the end had a little bit of cutting here before. If I can save that, fine. If I can't, not a big deal. I just throw it away. And then instead of getting 12 out of the block, I'll get 11 or fewer. Who knows? We'll see. Okay, let's show you the next step. I've gotten all of these drilled out here. Because I wasn't careful to see which ones were the center, where the holes might have misaligned when I drilled all that way through 6 inches from the ends, I reamed them out with a drill bit to make sure they all fit. I only have 6 here that I suspect are likely to be failures, and I have only 4 salvaged brass tubes. The reason I suspect this might be a failure is you can see there's a big chip here. At best, it's going to be quite a bit shortened, and you may or may not be able to see there's a crack in this. So this one might fly apart on the lathe. That's why I'm going to wear that mask again. Now, I built an airplane some years ago using epoxies. It took over 3 years. For an embarrassingly long time, I had a vague idea that something was wrong with my understanding of 5-minute epoxy. What it does mean is that you only have 5 minutes of pot life or time to work with it and have things prepared to go. It takes quite a bit longer for it to cure. I'm not worried about getting all the epoxy off these salvaged things as long as they slip through there easily enough, because epoxy does stick to epoxy. I only buy 5-minute epoxy now from the local box store because I don't need the expensive stuff that goes into the airplane quality things. We'll have to come back tomorrow after this has had overnight to set up, even in over 90-degree heat, so that we can take the next step. One more quick thought about epoxies. The view tubes that I've seen before on how to epoxy these tubes tell you to be very careful to get it over the whole thing. No. I get it over about 2/3 or so, half to 2/3, because when I insert it with epoxy on it, it's a tight enough fit that when I rotate back and forth and slide it in, it's going to cover the end as well. And I'm going to have some oozing out over the end and make a real mess of my shop table, but that's not a major issue. Okay, now we're ready to go on the lathe. What I've done is I've taken and already faced the ends here of these 2 blocks. Who knows that in less than a half an hour we're going to have a finished pen assembled and ready to put in our pocket and go to use. I didn't show you the facing process because it's pretty routine. What I'm trying to do is just grind this down to where I have a very smooth acrylic on the outside and smooth brass on the inside. You don't want any gaps from where the drill bit might have wandered just a little bit when we're doing it. I've chosen purple because I happen to like purple. They are so beautiful. I've gotten 2 set up on the lathe here with the bushings in place to hold it one apart here. You can see that this end goes in quite a bit right here. So what? What I've taken is a longer one here for the bottom part of the pen and a shorter one here for the top part of the pen that has that void underneath the clip. If this one fails, I have a good one here, and I showed you earlier, I do have a purple one ready to go. In case this does fail, this will be the other half to it. I'm not going to stop the camera this time because it takes such a small amount of time to make this happen. I'm going to use a chisel that is carbon tipped, and we're just going to go right down through here quite quickly and then stop it and resume. But this is a time when I am very careful to wear my mask because there are going to be chips flying all over the place. I hope it doesn't damage the camera as close as I have to it. We're at 3,450 RPM and ready to roll. This is obviously not far enough. But what I found, and I don't really understand why, is with that carbon tipped chisel, it chips out and gouges quite a bit. So I switch over to another regular bit, which I do keep sharpened. There you saw it. I went just a little bit too far and it chipped out. So this one is not usable. I'm going to have to just salvage the brass tube and use this one. The salvaging operation is pretty straightforward. Just cut it down. Notice with my chisel here, I try to keep it at a fairly high angle as that rotates around. I don't want to dig in too straight. I want to kind of scrape it off the top. The best thing I've discovered for minimizing this chip out at the end is to have my blade go from the outside towards the center. I don't even need to turn the camera on to illustrate that, but it works much better than the tediousness of trying to sand it down when I get close. To the next step, which with an acrylic pen is going to be just a polish. And the polish that I just buy, I don't know how important it is to get this exact stuff. You can probably get something that's quite satisfactory at an automobile supply house. I don't really know, but I stick with this. It's not a problem. I'm not convinced that acrylics require any finishing other than just polishing. But with this Bocati, to show you how I do the super glue, I've turned this down, sanded it with 400 grit sandpaper, because I think that's adequate. Some people want to go to 600 or more, but to me 400 is enough. And then what I do is I wipe it with denatured alcohol to make sure I get as many of those particles of sanding out of there as I can. And look at how that becomes so beautiful. I run this at about 500 RPM. I use just a little piece of plastic to protect my finger. Put the super glue right here in just a paper towel. Now I've seen YouTubes that say anywhere from 10 to 20 coats. I think 6 is adequate, but that's my preference. Just put a little bit on the paper towel and put it on there. And for the first coat, I use a little bit of an accelerator just to make it dry a little bit quicker. I guess dry is not the proper word, cure is the right word. And I won't take your time to show you 6 coats of this. I won't use the accelerator again except for the last coat. Okay, so I'm going to show you now the sanding that I do. Some people use these little micro mesh pads, the different colors indicating the different coarsenesses of them. I have found they aren't really that necessary. I kind of like using the wet sanding sandpaper. And this time I'm going to start with a 400 grit. Just go back and forth again, letting it build up a little bit. We'll go 400, 800, 1200, and 2000. Okay, we've gone through the 2000. Now just one last time with a denatured alcohol to get any particles off there that might be there. And then we're ready to polish. So this is ready for assembly. But what I will do is I'll take and get some heavier grit sandpaper, 150, and just do the touch up the ends just a little bit in case any of that super glue has come over the ends, because I want brass to brass. So let's talk about the use of this mandrel. It took me an embarrassing long time to figure out how to use this mandrel. I finally noticed, oh, it's threaded at this end. And why do I have this little knurled nut? Because what I had been doing is just pushing it into my rotating stock here, and that meant that I had to keep pushing and pushing it together to get enough friction to hold these things so that they wouldn't turn. But doing that, when this shaft is in compression, the only place it can go is to bow out a little bit. Whereas if I put this on here and tighten it down, now I have the compression applied only to the bushings, and the shaft is being pulled straight. So it works a whole lot better that way. But a lot of these little details I really wasn't able to pick up. So now we're over at the assembly area, and I'll show you what I check for. One is these are about the same length. I don't have one significantly shorter than the other that I have to fudge with. There are two fudge factors here. One is the area that is going to go underneath the clip, and the other one is I can push the transmission in a little bit farther or less depending on what I need. Another thing, if I've got minor imperfections, a little chip here, I can usually hide it by putting it under the clip. Another thing I look for is the band that goes in the center is a different diameter than the nib through which the ink finally appears. This is 333 thousandths, this is 326 thousandths. And that difference is very noticeable. So if I get one that's a slightly smaller diameter than the other, that's the one that's going to go where the nib is. But I can't check it with that because that would mean forcing it in there, and I don't really want to do that, because that might not be where it's going to go. So let's see if I can, instead of talking, think about what I'm doing. This is the one that I want to be with a nib. It's just a tiny bit smaller than the others. So I'll line it up that way, and then I just turn to my vise and start putting it together. Oh, one more thing to look for is when you find the nicest part of the pen, whatever is the most beautiful, that obviously does not want to go underneath the clip. It is really important when you're using the vise to make sure you do things absolutely square. You want to keep it lined up properly, because I've crushed many in an improper way that I've therefore had to throw away. So that's in. And now I said this one's going to go here. Feels like I got that pretty well. And now when I put the transmission in, I'm not going to put it in all the way. I'm only going to put it in part way and then check it to make sure it's the proper depth against the ink tube. So that's about right. Now we'll slide this in here. Screw it in, push it in. It's not coming out quite far enough, so I can push it in a little bit further here. Okay, it retracts perfectly. It's looking good. So let's put the whole pen together, and we are finished. That's all there is to it. Here's a bit of what I've made in the last couple of weeks. This morning I made 4 pens in about 2 hours. I'll never forget when I made about 500 for a charity to give to their donors at the end of the year, the expression on the executive director's face when I told her this box is worth between $8,000 and $10,000. Well, I don't sell these, I just use them as gifts. But you may use them, of course, any way you wish. May you enjoy your efforts.